Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating geopolitical detective story. We're going to look at Europe's dramatic and honestly kind of improbable rise to global dominance. So let's just jump right in. Okay, 10.18 million. That's 10.18 million square kilometers. To put that massive number into perspective for you, that actually makes Europe the second smallest continent on Earth. It sits just barely ahead of Australia in terms of landmass. So physically speaking, it's really quite tiny in the grand scheme of the globe. Which immediately brings us to our central mystery for today. How exactly did such a geographically small area come to exercise this enormous, world-altering influence over global politics, economics, culture, and science? I mean, really think about it. How did the second smallest continent actually shape the modern world? To solve this puzzle, our explainer today is going to follow 6 crucial clues. We'll be looking at 1. The European paradox. 2. Peninsula of peninsulas. 3. Foundations of the West. 4. The Great Awakening. 5. The Age of Expansion. And finally, 6. The Recipe for Dominance.
Let's start with our first clue. Section 1. The European paradox. Outsized global influence.
So, what makes this tiny landmass the cradle of Western civilization? Well, the absolute bedrock of the modern world really originated right here. We're talking about the core concepts that govern our daily lives, everything from ancient Greek democracy and international law to industrialization, capitalism, socialism, and modern science. These very ideas eventually built the massive, powerful institutions that run our world today. Think the European Union, NATO, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE. It's a true paradox, right? This relatively tiny physical size versus just an immense global influence. Moving along to our second section, let's look at the actual physical stage where this sweeping history played out. Section 2, Peninsula of Peninsulas, Geography as Destiny. You know, geographers brilliantly define Europe as a peninsula of peninsulas. Basically, the continent is the western extension of the massive Eurasian landmass. But instead of being just one solid, unbroken block of land, it's made up of numerous projecting peninsulas. We're talking the Iberian, Italian, Balkan, Scandinavian, and Jutland peninsulas. And this unique, jagged shape is a huge deal. It provides incredible, almost uninterrupted coastal access with natural harbors. And as we're going to see, that becomes absolutely vital for maritime trade and global exploration down the line. Now, internally, Europe is carved up by some highly protective mountain ranges. You've got the Alps stretching across France, Switzerland, Italy, and beyond, plus the Caucasus separating Europe from Asia. But here's the real kicker. While the mountains divided populations, the rivers connected them. Europe possesses an incredibly highly navigable river transport network. Take the Danube, which flows through 10 different countries. Then there's the Rhine, Europe's busiest commercial river, connecting Germany, Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. Not to mention the Volga, the Thames, and the Seine. These waters acted as natural highways, literally fueling trade, navigation, and agriculture for centuries. And despite its small size, Europe harbors some pretty extreme environmental diversity. I mean, you can travel from the oceanic, rain-heavy climates of the UK, Ireland, and France, over to the cold continental winters of Germany, Poland, and Hungary. Head south, and you hit the hot, dry Mediterranean summers in Italy, Spain, and Greece. Go far north, and you're in the freezing polar zones of Norway and Iceland. This intense variety meant different regions had vastly different economies and agricultural systems. And what does that do? It effectively forces early European nations to trade and interact with one another just to thrive. With the geographic board firmly set, let's look at the historical foundations laid right on top of it. Section 3, Foundations of the West, from Antiquity to the Middle Ages. It's fascinating to see how this causal chain builds over thousands of years. Starting way back between 3000 BCE and 476 CE, ancient Europe gives us Greek democracy and Roman law. Following Rome's collapse in 476, we enter medieval Europe, which runs until about 1500. This era is defined by feudalism, but importantly, it's also when the very first major universities emerged. Those institutions laid the absolute vital groundwork for the 14th to 16th century Renaissance, a massive intellectual rebirth. And ultimately, that accumulation of knowledge triggers the 18th century Industrial Revolution, where a mass production officially kicks off in Britain. So, with those early universities popping up in the Middle Ages, what happened next to accelerate this timeline? That brings us to Section 4, The Great Awakening, a Rebirth of Knowledge.
Well, Europe experienced this massive intellectual rebirth, known as the Renaissance, and the scientific revolution that followed right on its heels. These movements fundamentally transformed humanity's understanding of nature, art, and science. Starting in Italy, this era completely revived ancient philosophies and totally pushed the boundaries of human knowledge.
And the crucial takeaway here is that thinkers like Copernicus and Kepler, with modern astronomy, Newton with his laws of motion, and Galileo with his astronomical advancements, they didn't just discover new things. They actually created the scientific method. This was a total game changer. It entirely shifted how humanity interacted with the physical world, moving society away from superstition and toward observable, replicable, testable science.
And that scientific boom directly fueled our next chapter. Section 5, The Age of Expansion, Reaching Beyond Borders. Armed with incredible new maritime technology and eventually the steam engines and textile machines of the Industrial Revolution, nations like Britain transitioned into absolute manufacturing powerhouses. The transformation was so total, in fact, that Britain earned a very famous moniker, the workshop of the world. They were undergoing massive urbanization and mass production, literally making goods for a newly interconnected globe. But of course, this insatiable drive for raw materials and global markets led straight to sweeping colonial expansion. And the historical record shows two distinct, deeply complicated sides to this. On one hand, you had structural developments, things like the construction of railways, modern education systems, and new forms of administration. But on the other hand, this era inflicted devastating negative effects, including rampant exploitation, slavery, forced economic dependence, and intense cultural domination. It was a deeply complex era that irreversibly reshaped the entire globe. Let's move to our final section and see how all of these historical clues synthesize into our grand reveal. Section 6, The Recipe for Dominance. You see, Europe's dominance wasn't just one single lucky event. It was a highly interconnected 7-part recipe. It all started with favorable geography, which enabled maritime strength. That was paired with a scientific revolution leading straight into an industrial revolution. That massive scale of production required colonial expansion, and it was all held together by strong political institutions and a relentless drive for education and innovation. It is the perfect synthesis of all these factors that created a global superpower out of such a tiny landmass. As we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. When you look at the legal frameworks, the economic structures, the tech, and the scientific systems operating all around you right now, how do these historical European foundations continue to shape the contemporary society you live in today? It really makes you look at the world a little differently, doesn't it? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating historical puzzle with us, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.